The only sounds in the vast, silent room were the rustle of expensive silk sheets and the soft, broken whispers that slipped past her lips. Her fingers clenched in the fabric, a fragile anchor in a swirling storm of sensation that he had created. Moonlight, cold and unforgiving, spilled through the tall French windows, tracing the elegant curve of her spine and the tense muscles in his shoulders as he moved above her. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't part of the agreement. This feeling, this overwhelming, terrifying feeling, was a breach of contract. "Ethan, please, we shouldn't," she breathed out, the words a ghost of protest against his skin, a final, futile attempt to remember the lines she was supposed to play. He paused, his lips hovering just above hers, his breath warm and smelling of expensive whiskey and regret. His eyes, dark pools of conflicted desire in the dim light, held hers captive. "Just for tonight, Maya," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly promise that vibrated through her very core. "Just be mine." And as he lowered his head, capturing her mouth in a kiss that tasted of desperation and forbidden hunger, her resistance crumbled into a soft cry that was part surrender, part ecstasy. Her body arched to meet his, betraying every carefully constructed wall she had built around her heart. When the storm passed, a profound stillness settled over the room. They lay tangled together, the air thick with unspoken words. This was a guest suite in the sprawling Vance estate in Connecticut, a gilded cage of old money and older secrets. He was Ethan Vance, the heir apparent, a man groomed for power, trapped by duty. And she was Maya Reed, the woman he had hired, an artist drowning in debt, plucked from obscurity to play the role of his loving fiancée. Their script was simple, their objective clear: convince his dying grandfather that his legacy would pass into the hands of a man in a stable, loving relationship. The contract, bound in leather and meticulous legal jargon, defined every aspect of their public life. But it had said nothing about this. It had said nothing about the searing heat that ignited with a simple touch, the magnetic pull that drew them together in the dark, or the way her name sounded when he whispered it in the dead of night. In the daylight hours, she was his adoring partner, and he was her devoted future husband. But here, in the stolen hours of the night, where the lie was stripped away with their clothes, the contract was nothing more than forgotten words on a page, and their shared desire was the only truth that remained. The story of how Maya Reed's life became entangled with Ethan Vance's did not begin with a stolen glance across a crowded room or a charming, serendipitous encounter. It began with the smell of turpentine and the stark, brutal reality of a final eviction notice. Her studio apartment, a chaotic sanctuary of half-finished canvases and splattered paint, felt more like a sinking ship than a home. Light, her closest companion and collaborator, streamed through the large, grimy window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the vibrant, passionate colors of her work. Her paintings were full of life, bursting with an energy and emotion that she herself felt was draining away, replaced by the low, constant hum of anxiety. The white envelope on her cluttered table, with its aggressive red lettering, was a testament to her failure. For all her talent, she couldn't paint her way out of debt. She was eating instant noodles directly from the pot, a ritual of financial desperation, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost ignored it, assuming it was another creditor with practiced, patient threats. But something made her answer. The voice on the other end was like nothing she had ever heard directed at her. It was smooth, cultured, and impeccably formal, a voice that belonged to a world of leather-bound books and tailored suits, not peeling paint and ramen noodles. He introduced himself as Alistair Finch, a legal representative from Vance Enterprises, and he spoke of a delicate and highly confidential business proposition on behalf of his client. The request was for a meeting, the very next day, at their headquarters. The vagueness was unsettling, yet it sparked a tiny ember of curiosity in the ashes of her hope. It was absurd, illogical, but it was a break in the bleak monotony of her impending homelessness. She agreed, her own voice sounding thin and uncertain against the rich timbre of his. The Vance Enterprises building was a spear of glass and steel piercing the New York skyline, a monument to a kind of power and wealth Maya had only ever observed from a distance. The lobby was a cavern of polished marble and hushed reverence. As the silent, swift elevator carried her upwards, she felt a growing sense of dislocation, as if she were ascending to another plane of existence. Her worn-out combat boots, a familiar comfort, felt clumsy and loud on the plush, silent carpet of the executive floor. "Mr." Finch greeted her with a polite, impersonal smile and led her down a hallway that felt more like an art gallery, with imposing, abstract paintings that were probably worth more than she would make in a lifetime. He opened a heavy oak door, revealing an office that seemed to float above the city. And there he was. Ethan Vance was not standing to greet her. He was behind a vast, dark wood desk, his back to the door, looking out at the panoramic view of Manhattan spread below like a conquered kingdom. The office was just like him, minimalist, impeccably clean, and radiating an aura of absolute control. When he finally turned, his movements were economical and precise. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit him so perfectly it seemed to have been stitched onto his skin. His face was all sharp angles and intelligent lines, but it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a stormy sea, sharp and discerning, and they held a deep, profound weariness that his pristine appearance couldn't quite conceal. He didn't offer her a seat. He simply gestured to one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. "Miss Reed," he said, his voice calm and measured, lacking any real warmth. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." He wasted no time on pleasantries. He spoke as if he were discussing a corporate merger or an acquisition, his tone detached and clinical. "I have a situation that requires a unique solution," he began, steepling his fingers. "I require a fiancé for a period of 6 months. Your role will be to portray this person convincingly in front of my family, and specifically, my grandfather." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. Maya stared, momentarily speechless. She had imagined 1,000 scenarios, from a bizarre art commission to a case of mistaken identity, but not this. "Your life, as you know it, will be put on hold," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "You will live in my family's estate in Connecticut. You will learn a history that is not your own. In return, you will be compensated with a sum that will solve your current difficulties and secure your future for a considerable time." He slid a thick, leather-bound folio across the polished surface of the desk. It landed with a soft, final thud. "Your new life," he said, a ghost of a wry smile touching his lips for an instant. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were pages of typed text, photographs, and timelines. It was a meticulously crafted fabrication of a life, of a love story. The day we met, a charity auction at the Met. Our first date, a small Italian restaurant in the village. Your favorite flower, white peonies. An inside joke about a spilled glass of champagne. It was a script, a Bible for the role she was to play, and it was the most insulting, audacious thing she had ever seen. The blood rushed to her face, a hot wave of indignation. "You think you can just buy a person?" she asked, her voice quiet but vibrating with defiance. "Write a history and expect someone to live inside of it?" For the first time since she had entered the room, his composure flickered. For just a second, the mask of the cold, calculating businessman slipped, and she saw something else in his eyes. It wasn't arrogance or condescension. It was a raw, aching desperation, a flicker of pain so profound it mirrored the hopelessness she felt when she looked at her own eviction notice. In that fleeting moment, she understood that he was just as trapped as she was, albeit in a much more luxurious cage. He needed this, for reasons he wasn't sharing, and he needed it badly. That glimpse of vulnerability, of a shared human desperation, changed everything. He leaned back in his chair, the mask sliding back into place, but his voice was a fraction less detached when he spoke. "We all play roles, Miss Reed, every day. Some are simply more lucrative than others." He looked from her defiant eyes to the file on the desk, then back again. "I'm not buying a person. I'm securing my family's legacy. I am offering you a way out of your predicament, a chance to pursue your art without the constant threat of failure hanging over you. I am offering you a future." He was right. The thought of 6 months without the gnawing anxiety, the freedom to paint without the pressure of selling, the sheer relief of financial security, it was a temptation too powerful to ignore. She looked at this beautiful, broken man, a king in his lonely castle in the sky, and she saw an unsettling kinship, They were both selling a piece of themselves to survive. She closed the folio, her decision made. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a strange, calm resignation. "I'll do it," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it echoed in the silent, cavernous office like a gavel falling. Ethan Vance simply nodded, the transaction complete. Mr. Finch materialized as if on cue, a contract in hand. The signing was swift, the legal language a blur. As Maya stood to leave, a cashier's check for an unimaginable amount in her purse, and the Bible of her new life under her arm, the entire experience felt surreal. She walked out of the building and back into the noisy, chaotic streets of New York, but the city no longer felt the same. She felt like Persephone, having just agreed to spend 6 months in the underworld. She had bought her freedom, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the price she had agreed to pay was far greater than she could possibly comprehend. She had just made a deal with a very handsome, very lonely devil. The journey from the chaotic, vibrant pulse of New York City to the stately, hushed greenery of Connecticut felt like a passage into another dimension. Maya sat in the back of a black, silent sedan that glided over the asphalt with an unnerving smoothness. She watched the familiar landscape of concrete and graffiti bleed into sprawling suburbs, which in turn dissolved into the deep, ancient woods of New England. In her lap, her hands were clenched around the strap of her bag, where the leather-bound folio Ethan had given her rested like a weight. She had spent the last 48 hours memorizing its contents, trying to absorb the life of a woman who didn't exist, a woman who loved Ethan Vance. She had studied the fabricated memories, the preferred restaurants, the fictional inside jokes until her own identity felt thin and translucent. She was an artist, used to creating worlds on canvas, but this was different. This time, she was the canvas, and Ethan was the artist, painting a new reality directly onto her skin. The car slowed, turning off the main road and onto a long, winding driveway flanked by towering oak trees that formed a natural cathedral. And then the house appeared. It wasn't a house, it was an institution. A magnificent Georgian-style mansion of red brick and ivy, with windows that stared out over perfectly manicured lawns, like patient, knowing eyes. It was undeniably beautiful, a masterpiece of architecture and landscaping, but it was a cold beauty. It felt less like a home and more like a fortress, built to keep the world, and perhaps joy itself, at a comfortable distance. As the car crunched to a halt on the gravel courtyard, a stern-looking woman in a crisp uniform, the housekeeper, opened the car door before the driver could. Ethan's entire demeanor shifted. The weary, desperate man from the office in the city was gone, replaced by the stoic, burdened air of the Vance legacy. He became more rigid, his voice more formal, as he stepped back onto his ancestral turf. He led her inside, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous, marble-floored foyer. The air smelled of lemon polish, old wood, and the faint floral scent of lilies that seemed to be arranged in funereal displays. Before they were to meet his grandfather, Ethan pulled her aside into a small, book-lined study. He was tense, pacing in front of a cold fireplace. "Listen to me," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Just stick to the script. Be charming, be agreeable, but let me do most of the talking. My grandfather, he notices things. He can see a lie from a mile away." The warning did little to calm her nerves. It only amplified the frantic beating of her heart. She felt like an actor about to walk on stage for opening night without a single rehearsal. Walter Vance was waiting for them in a glass-walled sunroom overlooking a vast autumnal garden. He was in a wheelchair, a thick cashmere blanket draped over his lap, and the years had carved deep lines into his face. But his frailty was deceptive. The moment Maya walked in, his eyes, a startling shade of blue, as sharp and clear as ice, locked onto hers. They weren't the clouded eyes of a man at the end of his life. They were the shrewd, analytical eyes of the patriarch who had built an empire. Ethan made the introductions, his voice stiff with a practiced formality. Maya offered her hand, and Walter took it. His skin felt like dry paper, but his grip was surprisingly firm. "So," Walter said, his voice a dry rustle, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're the one." He subjected her to a polite but intense interrogation, asking about her art, her family, her life in Brooklyn, all the while scrutinizing her every response. The real test came when he leaned forward slightly, a glint in his eye. "So, tell me, young lady. I must admit I am curious. How does a brilliant artist from a world of passion and color capture the heart of my perpetually busy, very practical grandson? This was the moment. The air grew thick with tension. Ethan opened his mouth, ready to deliver the pre-rehearsed, sterile story from their Bible about a charity auction. But in a flash of instinct, a surge of artistic defiance, Maya knew it would never work. That story was as cold and lifeless as the marble foyer. She needed to create a truth. She placed a gentle hand on Ethan's arm, a gesture that was both a signal for him to stop and a remarkably convincing act of affection. She turned her full attention to Walter, her expression softening. "It wasn't at some fancy gala, Mr. Vance," she began, her voice finding a warm, confidential tone. "Ethan would probably be embarrassed for me to admit it." She glanced at Ethan, who was staring at her, his expression a mixture of panic and astonishment. "I saw him at the Met, months ago. He was standing in front of a Mark Rothko painting. He wasn't networking or making a deal, he was just looking. And the way he was looking at it, so completely absorbed, he seemed like the loneliest man in the entire city. I didn't even know who he was then. I just saw a man who felt things deeply." She let the image settle in the quiet room. "A week later, I was leaving a small gallery in Chelsea, and I literally walked right into him, spilling coffee all over his very expensive coat. It was my chance. I couldn't let the universe give me a sign that obvious and just walk away." A deep silence followed her story. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but it was woven from a thread of truth she had intuited. From the very beginning, Ethan's profound loneliness. It made him vulnerable, human, and it made their connection feel authentic. Ethan was utterly speechless, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. He watched, mesmerized, as this woman he had hired transformed his cold, contractual arrangement into a plausible, even beautiful, narrative. A slow, genuine smile spread across Walter Vance's wrinkled face. He reached out and patted her hand. "Spirit," he rasped, his blue eyes twinkling. "She has spirit, Ethan. Whatever you do, don't you dare let this one get away." Later that evening, the tension of the day had finally dissipated, leaving behind a strange new awareness between them. Ethan found Maya in the cavernous library, standing before a towering wall of books, a small glass of brandy in her hand. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on the room. He poured himself a drink and stood beside her, not speaking for a long moment. "Where did that come from?" he finally asked, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier tension. It wasn't an accusation, but a question of genuine curiosity. The story about the museum. She took a sip of her drink, the fiery liquid a welcome warmth in her chest. "The best lies are wrapped in a little bit of truth," she said, turning to look at him. "You did look like the loneliest man in the world in your office that day." His gaze softened, the corporate armor dissolving for a moment. "You were surprisingly convincing today," he admitted, a grudging compliment that felt more meaningful than any effusive praise. "You were terrified," she countered with a small smile. He let out a short, surprised laugh, a real laugh that reached his eyes. "That obvious?" he asked. "Painfully," she replied, and this time, they both smiled. In the shared warmth of the fire, surrounded by the ghosts of his ancestors, the first fragile thread of a real connection was woven between them. It wasn't in the contract, and it wasn't part of the performance. It was a dangerous, unplanned, and utterly undeniable beginning. The fragile truce established in the library was a fleeting warmth, a single candle lit against a coming storm. The next evening, that storm arrived in the form of a formal family dinner. The dining room at the Vance estate was a place of intimidating splendor. A long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the cold, glittering light of a crystal chandelier. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck and unspoken resentments. Maya, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress that Ethan's assistant had provided, felt like an exotic bird placed in a cage of gilded hawks. She was seated next to Ethan, her hand occasionally finding his under the table in a gesture that was half performance, half a genuine need for an anchor. Across from them sat Ethan's Aunt Eleanor, a woman with a spine as straight as her string of pearls and eyes that missed nothing. Flanking her were a smattering of cousins and their spouses, all bearing the same polished, predatory sheen. If Walter was the heart of the family, Eleanor was its gatekeeper, the guardian of its pristine social standing. The conversation was a minefield of polite, probing questions directed at Maya. They asked about her art with a thinly veiled condescension, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. She felt less like a guest and more like a specimen under a microscope, her life's work and passions reduced to a quaint, unsuitable hobby for the future Mrs. Vance. Ethan was tense beside her, his answers clipped and defensive, his discomfort a palpable thing in the air. The tipping point came with the dessert course. Eleanor placed her fork down with a delicate, deliberate click. "It's all just so wonderfully sudden, Ethan," she said, her voice laced with a sweet venom. She looked directly at Maya, but her words were for her nephew. "We were all under the impression that you and Victoria were discussing the next step. A partnership of that caliber is so rare. She was so looking forward to chairing the fundraiser at the yacht club with you next month." The name dropped onto the table like a shard of ice. A profound, immediate silence fell over the room. Forks and spoons paused midair. The only sound was the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of Maya's humiliation. Ethan's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along his cheek. This was a direct attack, a calculated move to expose her as an outsider, an interloper. But Maya didn't crumble. In that frozen moment, she found a strange clarity. She was an artist, and this was her stage. Instead of shrinking, she leaned into the role. She placed her hand over Ethan's on the tablecloth, a picture of supportive grace. She turned to Eleanor, her smile warm and genuine, disarmingly so. "Victoria is a remarkable woman," she said, her voice even and calm. "Ethan has told me how much he respects her." She then looked from Eleanor's narrowed eyes to the other curious faces around the table before letting her gaze settle lovingly on Ethan. "But sometimes the heart makes a choice the mind doesn't see coming. It isn't always practical or convenient, it's just true." She squeezed his hand. "Isn't that right, darling?" The performance was flawless. She had not only defended herself, but she had framed their relationship as a grand, undeniable romance, subtly painting Eleanor's pragmatism as cold and unfeeling. The tension broke. Ethan looked at her, his gratitude and astonishment warring in his eyes, and gave a tight, assenting nod. The cousins began to chatter about something else, and Eleanor, momentarily silenced, took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. After the dinner from hell, the family dispersed into the various drawing rooms, but the facade had taken its toll. Ethan was withdrawn, the earlier tension having hardened into a cold, remote anger. He excused himself with a curt murmur about phone calls, leaving Maya standing alone in the grand, echoing hall. She felt the crushing weight of the lie, the suffocating opulence of the house. She had won the battle, but the war felt endless. Needing to breathe air that wasn't thick with perfume and hypocrisy, she slipped out one of the French doors and into the cool night. The gardens were a labyrinth of sculpted hedges and pale sleeping flowers under a sliver of moon. The air was clean, scented with damp earth and the sweet, heavy fragrance of night-blooming jasmine. She found him on a stone terrace overlooking a dark, silent pond. He had shed his jacket and loosened his tie, and he was staring out into the darkness, a heavy crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand. The perfect, polished armor of Ethan Vance was gone. In his place was just a man, burdened and unguarded. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough, not looking at her, "for what you did in there, with my aunt. You're a better actor than I gave you credit for." She came to stand beside him, leaning against the cold stone balustrade. "It wasn't an act," she said quietly. "Not really. It's not hard to defend something you want to believe is real." The words hung between them, blurring the line between the performance and the truth. He took a long swallow of his whiskey, the silence stretching on. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, stripped of its usual authority, filled instead with a raw, weary honesty. "This house," he said, with a gesture that encompassed the entire estate, "it's a monument to expectation." He looked at her then, and she saw the flicker of the lonely man from the museum. "My father. He spent his entire life trying to live up to my grandfather. He doubled the company's value, but it was never enough. Nothing was ever just for fun. Everything was a lesson, a test. He stared down into his glass. I remember him trying to teach me how to sail. I must have been 10. It wasn't about the wind and the water. It was about strategy, about tacking for a competitive advantage, about winning. I fell overboard, and the first thing he said when he pulled me out wasn't, "Are you okay?" It was, "What did you learn?" In that story, Maya saw the entire architecture of the man beside her. The coldness, the control. It wasn't a choice. It was a cage built for him long ago. She didn't offer him pity. She offered him a piece of her own truth. "My father was the opposite," she said softly. "He was a jazz musician. He had 1,000 beautiful dreams and not a single practical bone in his body. He taught me how to see the color in a piece of music, how to find the story in a shadow, but he never learned how to pay the rent with it. He gave me a world of beauty that I couldn't afford to live in." Ethan turned to face her fully, his stormy eyes searching hers in the dim light. In that moment, they weren't employer and employee. They weren't the billionaire and the hired help. They were just two people, from impossibly different worlds, who had found a startlingly familiar wound in each other, the ghosts of their fathers. An unspoken understanding passed between them, an intimacy deeper than any touch. The attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface was no longer just about a forbidden physical desire. It was becoming emotional. She was beginning to see the prisoner trapped inside the prince, and for the first time she felt a dangerous, terrifying urge to set him free. The emotional intimacy they discovered on the moonlit terrace was a dangerous secret, a fragile seed planted in the sterile soil of their arrangement. For days they avoided it, retreating into the safety of their defined roles. They were polite, professional, the perfect fake fiancés in the daylight hours. But a tension now hummed constantly beneath the surface, an invisible string pulling them taut. Every accidental brush of hands, every look held a fraction of a second too long, sent a jolt of awareness through them both. They were living in the quiet before a storm, and that night, the storm broke. It began with a low, distant rumble, the sky darkening from a soft twilight gray to a bruised, angry purple. The wind began to howl, rattling the old, leaded glass windows of the mansion. Maya was in her room, trying to lose herself in a book, when the lights flickered once, twice, and then died. The house was plunged into a sudden, profound darkness, the silence that followed even more unnerving than the rising wind. It was a primal darkness, the kind that swallows sound and makes a house of that size feel both infinitely vast and terrifyingly claustrophobic. Her phone provided only a weak, pathetic beam of light. Drawn by an instinct she didn't understand, she left her room and made her way through the darkened halls, her footsteps echoing, towards the only sign of life, a faint, flickering glow coming from the library. Ethan was there, kneeling before the massive stone hearth, the fire he had just built beginning to catch, casting, dancing, long shadows across the walls of books. He hadn't heard her enter. He looked different in the firelight, stripped of his usual authority. He was just a man, creating a small circle of warmth against the encroaching dark. He looked up as she approached, and the carefully constructed walls between them seemed to dissolve in the flickering gloom. He didn't question why she was there. It felt natural, inevitable, that they would seek each other out. He gestured to the floor, and she sank down onto the thick, plush rug, pulling her knees to her chest. For a long time, they didn't speak, simply watching the flames devour the kindling and listening to the storm rage outside. The rain began to lash against the windows, a furious, relentless assault. The power outage had stripped them of all distractions, of all pretense. They were no longer the billionaire and his hired fiancée. They were just a man and a woman, trapped together by a storm, seeking refuge in a small pocket of light. The conversation, when it began, was quiet, fragmented. They spoke of small things, of childhood fears of thunderstorms, of the strange comfort of a fire in the dark. The emotional honesty from their night on the terrace returned, deeper now in this forced, primal intimacy. She felt a draft from one of the tall windows and shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Ethan noticed immediately. He rose and disappeared into the shadows, returning with a heavy cashmere throw blanket. He knelt behind her and draped it gently around her shoulders. His movements were slow, deliberate. As he settled the soft fabric around her, his fingers brushed against the bare skin of her neck, just above the collar of her simple cotton nightgown. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it was like a lit match to dry tinder. A sharp, electric shock coursed through her, and she drew in a sharp breath. He froze behind her, his hand still resting on her shoulder. The world seemed to shrink to that single, searing point of contact. The roar of the storm, the crackle of the fire, it all faded into a dull hum. The only thing she was aware of was the warmth of his fingers on her skin. He didn't move away. He moved closer, shifting to kneel in front of her. He raised his other hand, slowly, as if not to spook a wild animal, and cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked gently across her jawline, his gaze intense, searching, full of a raw, unguarded want that mirrored the desperate ache in her own chest. This was it, the precipice they had been circling for days. Reason, her last line of defense, made a final, futile stand. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, so quiet it was almost lost to the storm. "We can't. This isn't in the contract." He leaned in until his forehead rested against hers, his eyes closing for a brief second. A shudder racked his body. "To hell with the contract," he breathed, his voice a low, rough growl against her lips, and then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss, it was a deluge, a breaking of a dam. It was hungry, desperate, and filled with all the unspoken tension, all the forbidden longing that had been building between them. It was the taste of whiskey and loneliness and a profound, aching need that she recognized as her own. Her hands, which had been resting limply in her lap, came up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer, surrendering completely to the storm inside that was now more powerful than the one outside. He pulled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes dark with passion in the firelight. He looked at her, truly looked at her, in her simple, long-sleeved cotton nightgown. It was modest, unadorned, the kind of thing a woman wore for comfort, not for seduction, and in that moment, he found it unbearably beautiful. His gaze was a question, a plea. Her slight trembling nod was all the answer he needed. With an almost reverent slowness, his hands went to the hem of the gown, and he drew it up and over her head, casting it aside into the shadows. The firelight kissed her skin, revealing the delicate, simple white lace of her underwear. It wasn't meant for him. It was a secret piece of beauty she kept for herself, and that knowledge made his desire for her burn even hotter. His hands trembled as he explored the curve of her waist, the swell of her hips. Her shoulders shuddered under his touch. There was no more hesitation. This was not slow or gentle. It was a raw, frantic collision of two desperately lonely souls. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing and laid her down on the thick rug before the fire, its warmth seeping into her back. The world became a dizzying kaleidoscope of sensation, the heat of the fire on her skin, the surprising softness of the rug beneath her, the solid strength of his body covering hers, the sound of their ragged breaths and soft cries mingling with the roar of the thunder. It was hurried, intense, a frantic, unspoken conversation between their bodies. It was a desperate search for something real in a world built on lies. And as the storm outside reached its crescendo, he cried out her name, Maya, not in a shout of pleasure, but in a broken, desperate whisper, as if he had just found the only true thing in his entire gilded life. Maya woke to the cold. The fire, which had been their sun and their sanctuary, had died in the night, leaving behind a pile of gray, skeletal embers. A pale, unforgiving morning light filtered through the tall library windows, stripping the room of its magic and exposing it for what it was, a scene of transgression. The storm had passed, leaving a world washed clean and unnervingly silent. The cashmere blanket was tangled around her legs, a poor defense against the chill that had seeped not just into the room, but into her bones. He was already awake, sitting in one of the leather armchairs, his back to her. He was dressed, though his shirt was untucked, and his hair was uncharacteristically disheveled. He was staring at the dead fireplace, his posture rigid, with a tension that radiated across the room. The intimate, breathing space that had existed between them for a few stolen hours had been replaced by a vast, silent chasm. She sat up, pulling the heavy blanket around her bare shoulders like a shield. Her simple cotton nightgown lay in a crumpled heap by the rug, a stark white flag of surrender. The memory of the night before rushed back in a hot, dizzying wave, the desperation in his kiss, the heat of his skin, the sound of her own name whispered in the dark. A deep, burning shame mixed with a confusing, undeniable longing. She felt exposed, not physically, but emotionally. She had let him see a part of her that was not in the contract, a vulnerable, wanting part she barely acknowledged to herself. Quietly, she retrieved her nightgown and slipped it on, the familiar fabric feeling foreign against skin that still tingled with the phantom touch of his hands. "Good morning," she finally said, her voice a dry, scratchy thing that was swallowed by the high ceilings. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders tightened. "Morning," he murmured, his voice low and gravelly. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, thick with unspoken regrets and unacknowledged truths. He finally rose from the chair and began to pace, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of profound agitation. He couldn't look at her. He was a man accustomed to control, and last night he had lost it completely. Now, in the cold light of day, he was scrambling to rebuild his fortress. "Maya," he began, his voice strained as he finally turned to face her, though his eyes focused somewhere over her shoulder. "About last night." The words were clinical, an item on an agenda. It was an anomaly. The storm, the power outage, the whiskey, it was a confluence of unfortunate circumstances. He presented the explanation like a lawyer making a case, laying out the evidence to mitigate the crime. He was trying to rationalize the beautiful, terrifying chaos they had created, to file it away as a logical error. It was a mistake, he concluded, the words sharp and final. A mistake. The word landed in her heart like a stone. A part of her wanted to scream, to rage against the cold dismissal of something that had felt so real, so vital. But what could she say? To argue, to admit that it had meant more to her, would be to destroy the fragile framework of her entire existence here. It would be an admission of a weakness she couldn't afford. So, she wrapped her denial around her like a second blanket. "Yes," she agreed, her voice surprisingly steady, though it felt like it belonged to someone else. "You're right. A mistake. It can't happen again," he stated, his gaze finally meeting hers. It was an order, not a suggestion. "It won't," she promised, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. They had made a pact, a verbal agreement to erase the night from their history, to rewind time and return to the safety of their contract. But it was impossible. The knowledge of each other was now a permanent part of their landscape. As they left the library, the air between them was charged with a new, excruciating awareness. He held the door for her, and she was careful to keep a deliberate distance, her body humming with the effort of not brushing against his. Later, in the kitchen, the power having returned, the silence was filled with the mundane sounds of the morning, the gurgle of the coffee machine, and the clink of a spoon against ceramic, but every simple gesture was magnified, imbued with a forbidden memory. She watched his hands, the same strong, confident hands that had explored her body with such desperate hunger, as they now moved with practiced ease, grinding beans, tamping the espresso. The memory was so vivid it was like a physical echo on her skin. She could almost feel the phantom pressure of his fingers on her waist, his palms on her back. He turned from the counter, and his gaze fell on her, lingering for a beat too long on the line of her throat as she sipped her tea. He looked away quickly, a faint flush creeping up his neck, his legendary composure completely gone. The professional barrier they had agreed to rebuild was a transparent, shimmering thing, utterly incapable of hiding the truth of what now lay between them. The physical act had unlocked something far more dangerous, a psychological craving. The profound loneliness that had been Maya's constant companion for years had returned with a vengeance, but it was sharper now, more painful. Last night, in his arms, she had felt, for a fleeting moment, completely and utterly seen. She had not been alone. To have that intimacy, that raw, unvarnished connection, and then to label it a mistake, was a unique form of torture. Their mutual denial didn't extinguish the desire. It transformed it, feeding it, making it stronger. By declaring it forbidden, they had made it irresistible. The first test of their new, fragile accord came with the sound of footsteps. The housekeeper, a kind, bustling woman named Mrs. Gable, entered the kitchen with a cheerful greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Vance, Miss Reed. I trust you both weathered the storm, all right?" Instantly, they snapped into character. The shift was jarring, almost violent. Ethan's face composed itself into a relaxed, affectionate smile. He moved to Maya's side and placed a casual, proprietary hand on the small of her back. "We managed just fine, thank you, Mrs. Gable," he said smoothly. But the touch was no longer just an act for an audience. It was a brand of fire against her skin, a searing reminder of the night before. It sent a tremor through her entire body. She had to use every ounce of her willpower to keep from flinching, to conjure a serene smile that felt brittle enough to shatter. They were back in the performance, but everything had changed. The lie was no longer just for his family. It was a new, suffocating lie they were telling each other and telling themselves. And as she stood there, smiling under the weight of his hand, she was struck by the terrifying, absolute certainty that nothing ever again would be simple. The pact they made in the cold morning light of the library, the agreement that their night of desperate passion was a mistake, was a fragile, flimsy thing. They tried to honor it, retreating into a forced, professional courtesy that was 1,000 times more intimate and unbearable than their previous arrangement. The air between them was thick with the memory of touch, with the ghost of whispers. Their lie had become a labyrinth, and they were both lost inside it. The next test of their resolve came not in the isolating quiet of the estate, but under the glittering, watchful eyes of New York's high society. It was a charity gala for the city hospital, an event where fortunes were pledged and reputations were polished. For Maya, it felt like being fed to the lions. Ethan's assistant had provided her with a dress the color of midnight, a sweep of silk that clung and flowed in all the right places, along with a diamond necklace that felt cold and heavy against her throat. She looked the part of a billionaire's fiancée, a perfect, polished accessory. But as they stepped out of the car into a sea of flashing camera bulbs, she felt the familiar panic of the imposter. Then, Ethan took her hand. His grip was firm, warm, and the simple contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the performance. It was a silent promise, a shared secret in the face of the watching world. This time, their performance was different. The awkward stiffness of their first public outing was gone, replaced by an easy, fluid grace that was dangerously convincing. When he placed his hand on the small of her back to guide her through the crowd, the touch was no longer just a prop. It was charged with the memory of that same hand stroking her skin in the firelight. When they smiled at each other, their eyes held a shared knowledge that made the smiles feel real. They were better actors now because they were no longer entirely acting. The desire they were trying so hard to deny in private fueled their public facade with an undeniable electric chemistry. People noticed. Whispers followed them, looks of admiration, of envy. They were the golden couple, the whirlwind romance of the season, and the lie was becoming beautiful, seductive, and terrifyingly easy to believe. Ethan introduced her to his colleagues, to board members, to old family friends. And he did it with a new kind of pride, his voice warm when he said her name. He was no longer just fulfilling a contract. He seemed to be genuinely showing her off. Buoyed by his confidence, Maya found her own. She spoke about her art not with the apology of a struggling artist, but with the passion of a woman who had found her calling. With Ethan's hand securely in hers, she felt, for the first time, not like she was wearing a costume, but like she was finally stepping into a version of herself she had always wanted to be. They were standing by the champagne fountain, sharing a laugh that was entirely genuine, when Maya felt the atmosphere shift. A subtle change in the current of the room, a collective turning of heads. She felt Ethan's hand tighten around hers, his body going rigid beside her, and then she saw her. Victoria Ashton did not simply enter a room. She took possession of it. She was breathtaking, a vision of cool, aristocratic elegance in a classic white gown that bespoke old money and effortless power. Her blonde hair was swept into a flawless chignon, and her smile was a perfect, polished weapon. She moved through the crowd, with the serene confidence of a queen gliding through her court, her eyes scanning the room until they landed, with chilling precision, on them. "Ethan, darling." Victoria's voice was like chilled champagne, smooth and sparkling. She glided to a stop in front of them, ignoring Maya completely, as she rose on her toes to press a cool, possessive kiss to Ethan's cheek. "I had a feeling I might find you here. You never can resist a good cause." Ethan's smile was a tight, brittle thing. "Victoria, I wasn't aware you were coming. I had a last-minute change of plans," she said, her eyes finally flicking to Maya. It wasn't a glance, it was an appraisal, a slow, deliberate scan from the diamonds at her throat to the tips of her shoes. It was designed to diminish, to categorize, to dismiss. "And you must be the distraction," she finished, her smile unwavering. "Victoria, this is Maya Reed," Ethan said, his voice strained. "Maya, Victoria Ashton." "Ah, the artist," Victoria purred, extending a hand with perfectly manicured nails. Her handshake was limp and brief. "Ethan told me he'd taken up a new charitable project. I just didn't realize it was a person. How charming." The insult was delivered with such surgical precision that it took Maya's breath away. Victoria then turned her full attention back to Ethan, her tone shifting, speaking of business deals, of mutual acquaintances, of future plans they supposedly shared, weaving a world so intricate and exclusive that Maya was left standing on the outside, an irrelevant footnote to their real lives. And in that moment, watching them, Maya saw everything with a sudden, painful clarity. She saw the complete and utter absence of warmth between them. Their conversation was a transaction, their body language that of two powerful allies, not lovers. There was no spark, no tenderness, no trace of the desperate, aching need she had felt from Ethan in the dark. There was only a shared history of social contracts and financial obligations. The night she and Ethan had shared wasn't just a physical mistake. It was an emotional intimacy he was completely starved of, an intimacy this perfect, cold woman could never provide. A feeling she had never experienced before rose up in her, fierce and hot and unfamiliar. It was a possessive, primal jealousy that shocked her with its intensity. This wasn't in the contract. This wasn't part of the job. This was real. This man, with all his flaws and his loneliness, had shared something real with her, and she would not stand by and watch this woman try to erase it with a condescending smile. A new resolve hardened within her. She was not a project. She was not a distraction. Instead of shrinking away, Maya tightened her grip on Ethan's arm, stepping closer to him, physically reclaiming her space at his side. She leaned in and smiled sweetly at Victoria. "It's so lovely to finally meet you," she said, her voice dripping with a sincerity that was its own form of attack. "But I'm afraid you'll have to forgive Ethan if his mind is elsewhere. He's been utterly consumed with the plans for our wedding." She looked up at Ethan, her eyes full of fake adoration. "In fact, he was just telling me he wants to skip the yacht club fundraiser altogether for a trip to Florence to scout locations." "Weren't you, darling?" The direct hit landed. Victoria's perfect smile faltered for just an instant. She had tried to paint Maya as temporary, and Maya had responded by painting a permanent future. Recognizing she had been outmaneuvered, Victoria regained her composure with a slight, cold nod. "How ambitious," she said. "We'll talk later, Ethan," she added, the words a clear command before turning and dissolving back into the crowd. The moment she was gone, the tension left with her, but it was replaced by a new, more potent and complicated energy between Ethan and Maya. He looked down at her, his expression a chaotic mixture of shock, gratitude, and something that looked dangerously like awe. The glittering illusion of the party had been shattered. Their fake relationship had just been baptized by fire, and in the process had been forged into something terrifyingly real. Standing amidst the oblivious, laughing crowd, they were no longer just acting. A line had been crossed, a battle had been fought and won, and the feelings they had both been so desperately trying to deny were now shimmering in the air between them, impossible to ignore. The car ride back to the estate was a study in silence. The glittering lights of Manhattan blurred into streaks of gold and silver outside the windows, but inside the plush, leather-scented interior of the sedan, the atmosphere was heavy and charged. Maya replayed the confrontation with Victoria over and over in her mind, the thrill of her small victory now mingling with a terrifying sense of having crossed a line. Beside her, Ethan was a statue carved from granite, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He hadn't said a word since they'd left the gala, but his silence was louder than any argument, vibrating with a complex mix of anger, shock, and something else she couldn't quite name. The moment the heavy front door of the mansion closed behind them, sealing them into the quiet of the house, the fragile truth shattered. He didn't turn on the main lights, leading the way to the library, their unofficial territory. which was illuminated only by a single, low-wattage lamp. He went straight to the decanter of whiskey, pouring a generous amount into a glass. The clink of the crystal, a sharp, aggressive sound in the stillness. "A trip to Florence," he said, his back still to her. His voice was dangerously quiet, tight with controlled fury. "That was a bold move, Maya, even for you." She bristled, her exhaustion from the night giving way to a defiant anger of her own. She slipped off her heels, the relief of it grounding her. "And what was I supposed to do, Ethan? Stand there and let her dismiss me like I was a piece of furniture you'd acquired? She was trying to erase me, to put me in my place." He turned around, his eyes dark and stormy. "Your place is the one defined by our contract, a contract you seem to be forgetting." "Oh, the contract," she shot back with a bitter laugh, taking a step towards him. "The one that says I'm supposed to be your loving, devoted fiancé? The one that I was upholding while you stood there and let that woman stake her claim on you? I did my job. Maybe a little too well for your liking." "This isn't about the job anymore, and you know it," he growled, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped just before her, forcing her to tilt her head back to look up at him. They were so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You enjoyed it, pushing her, claiming me. It was a power play." "And what if it was?" she challenged, her voice dropping to a breathless whisper. The anger between them was twisting into something else, something hotter and far more dangerous. The adrenaline from their public fight was now fueling a private war, and the air crackled with it. "You hired me to be convincing. Forgive me if the line is starting to blur." "What do you want from me, Maya?" he demanded, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders, his voice a raw, tormented sound. Her defiance melted away, replaced by a devastating honesty. She looked into his eyes, into the conflict and the loneliness she saw warring there, and she spoke her truth. "I want you to stop pretending," she breathed. "With them, with me, with yourself." That was it. That was the permission he had been waiting for. The final snap of his control. A groan tore from his throat. "I don't want to pretend with you, Maya," he confessed, his voice breaking. And then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was not like their first, desperate, frantic coupling in the storm. This was a conscious, deliberate claiming. It was a kiss of anger and possession, of frustration and a deep, undeniable hunger. It was a brutal, punishing kiss that she met with equal force, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him impossibly closer. He backed her up against the massive oak desk, his body pressing her into the hard wood. With a sudden, savage movement, his hand hooked under the silk strap of her expensive gown and tore it, the sound of the delicate fabric ripping a stark, satisfying violation of the night's pretense. He was no longer playing the part of the polished gentleman. This was raw. This was real. He broke the kiss to trail a fiery path down her throat, his teeth grazing her collarbone. He lifted her effortlessly and sat her on the edge of the desk, his hands sweeping aside a stack of papers and a heavy leather-bound book, which fell to the floor with a dull, final thud. Her world, his world, their carefully ordered arrangement, it was all being swept aside. He pushed the torn dress from her shoulders, letting it pool around her waist, and then he saw it. In the dim lamplight, he saw the black lace lingerie she wore beneath. It wasn't the simple, innocent white of their first encounter. This was different. This was intricate, deliberate, a secret armor of confidence she wore for herself. To him, it was an invitation, a sign that she was not a passive player in this, but a woman who understood her own power, her own desire. The sight of it made him groan, a low, guttural sound of appreciation and need. He knelt before her, his hands sliding up her thighs, his gaze full of a dark, worshipful fire. "Maya, tell me you want this," he growled, his voice thick with a desperate need for her to say the words, to make this a shared choice, a shared sin. She couldn't speak. She could only thread her fingers into his hair as he kissed the inside of her knee, his touch sending a tremor through her entire body. He took her lack of protest as an answer, his mouth continuing its slow, torturous path upward. As his lips found the warm skin of her inner thigh, a sob broke from her lips. She threw her head back, her fingers tightening their grip. "Ethan, please, don't stop." That was all he needed. He rose, shedding his suit jacket with an impatient shrug. He pushed the torn dress down and away, leaving her in nothing but the black lace that starkly contrasted with her pale skin in the dim light. He admired the curve of her waist, the swell of her full breasts above the delicate fabric, the perfect shape of her hips as she sat perched on his desk. He looked at her like a starving man presented with a feast. He captured her mouth again as he fumbled with his belt, their bodies pressing together, a frantic dance of need. He entered her with a single, powerful thrust that stole the breath from her lungs. She wrapped her legs around his waist, her nails digging into the hard muscles of his back, meeting his rhythm, claiming him as fiercely as he was claiming her. This was not the hurried, almost frantic coupling of their first time. This was a powerful, rhythmic claiming, a conscious act of possession and surrender. The sounds that filled the silent library were not of a storm, but of their own making, the soft moans, the sharp gasps, the whisper of skin against skin, the rustle of discarded silk on the floor. It was the sound of two people telling the truth in the only way they knew how. He leaned in, his forehead pressed against hers, their ragged breaths mingling. He looked deep into her eyes as he moved within her, his own gaze full of a painful, overwhelming emotion. "Maya," he whispered, his voice raw and thick, with a feeling that went far beyond lust. "You feel real." The words shattered the last of her defenses. He wasn't just talking about her body, he was talking about her, about the anchor she had become in his life of performance and lies. In his world of shadows, she was the only solid thing he could hold on to. And as he found his release, crying out her name in the sacred quiet of his family's library, she held him tightly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The contract was a ghost. The lie was a memory. This, right here, this raw and ruinous connection, was the only thing that was real. The second surrender in the library was not an ending, but a new beginning. It was a demolition. It leveled the flimsy, transparent walls they had tried to build between them, leaving the landscape of their relationship altered forever. The awkwardness of the morning after their first encounter was replaced by a profound, terrifying, and deeply comforting intimacy. The pretense didn't just blur, it evaporated like mist in the morning sun, and what was left was something so real it made Maya's heart ache with its impossibility. The contract, the leather-bound folio that had once been the Bible of her new existence, now sat in a drawer in her room, unread and irrelevant, a relic from a past that felt a lifetime away. Their lives settled into a new, unspoken rhythm. Their days were for Walter. They would spend hours in the sunroom with the old man, playing chess, reading the newspaper aloud, and listening to his stories of a bygone era. Maya discovered a genuine affection for the patriarch, and he, in turn, seemed to be revitalized by her presence. She brought a warmth and a vibrant, artistic energy into the sterile, quiet halls of the estate. And in these moments, with Walter smiling at a shared joke between them, their performance as a loving couple was effortless. It was no longer a performance at all. Ethan would look at her across the chessboard, a soft, private smile on his lips, and she would feel a jolt of pure, uncomplicated happiness that was immediately followed by a pang of guilt. But the nights belonged to them. After the house had settled into a deep, aristocratic slumber, their true life would begin. The desperate, frantic passion that had first ignited between them began to temper, evolving into something deeper, more exploratory, more tender. Their lovemaking was now often slow and languid, a form of communication that went beyond words. But more than that, the hours after were filled with whispered confessions in the dark. Tucked away in the massive bed in Ethan's room, a space that was slowly becoming hers as well, they traded secrets like forbidden currency. He told her about the crushing weight of his legacy, the constant, suffocating fear that he was just a custodian of his grandfather's greatness, not a creator of his own. He spoke of Victoria, not with anger, but with a hollow, weary emptiness, describing their relationship as a strategic alliance, a merger of two powerful families that had been orchestrated since they were in college. With her, he admitted one night, his voice a low murmur against her hair, "I always feel like I'm in a boardroom. With you, I feel like I'm home." In return, Maya offered him the pieces of her own life. She told him about her own father, the brilliant, troubled musician who had taught her to see the world in color and light but had left her with a deep-seated fear of failure and poverty. She spoke of her artistic insecurities, the terror of a blank canvas, the secret belief that she was a fraud, that her talent wasn't enough. He would listen, his hand stroking her back in the darkness, and he would make her feel not just heard, but understood. He was the first person to ever see both the artist and the terrified woman behind the art, and to value them both. This new, profound intimacy began to bleed into Ethan's other life, causing it to fray at the edges. Maya would see him glance at his phone when it buzzed, see Victoria's name flash on the screen, and then watch as he silenced it and put it face down on the table, his attention returning solely to her. She overheard a tense phone call with his COO, where Ethan sounded distracted, almost annoyed, by a multi-million-dollar issue, his impatience to end the call and get back to her a palpable thing. The man who had once ruled his empire with meticulous, detached control was becoming absent, his focus, his entire world, shrinking to the confines of the estate and the woman he had hired to live within it. The lie he had so carefully constructed to secure his future was now causing him to neglect it. The most dangerous moment, the one that signaled the true and final unraveling of their contract, came on a Tuesday afternoon. He had been in the city for the day, and for the first time, Maya had felt his absence like a physical ache. When he returned that evening, there was a quiet, nervous excitement about him she hadn't seen before. After dinner, he led her into the library. "I saw something today," he said, his voice softer than usual, "and I thought of you." He handed her a flat, rectangular package wrapped in simple brown paper. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was not a piece of jewelry or some other expensive, generic gift. It was a vintage, leather-bound sketchbook. The cover was soft and worn with age, and when she opened it, the paper inside was thick, creamy, and textured, the kind of paper she had dreamed of but could never afford. Tucked inside was a set of professional-grade charcoal pencils, rare and imported. It wasn't a gift for his fiancée, it was a gift for Maya. It was a testament to the fact that he had listened to every word she'd said, that he saw her not as a role she was playing, but as the artist she was, the artist she wanted to be. It was a profound gesture of belief in her talent, in her future. A wave of overwhelming emotion washed over her, so intense it made her dizzy. Tears welled in her eyes as she ran a hand over the beautiful, empty pages. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick, "it's beautiful." He stepped closer, his expression tender and a little uncertain. He gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I want to see you fill it," he said. "I want to see all the incredible things you'll create." And that's when the happiness shattered, replaced by a sudden, icy wave of terror. The sketchbook was a promise. The words he spoke were about a future that didn't exist. Their arrangement had a clear and definitive expiration date. In a few months, the contract would end, she would take her money, and she would walk out of his life forever. This gift, this perfect, thoughtful, intimate gift, was a violation of that reality. Sex could be explained away as a momentary loss of control, a physical need. But this was an act of the heart. It was an investment. It was a declaration. She looked from the beautiful object in her hands to the man standing before her, his stormy eyes filled with a genuine, unguarded affection, and she felt like the cruelest kind of fraud. The money in her bank account, the money that had once felt like salvation, now felt like blood money. She was falling deeply, irrevocably in love with a man she was fundamentally deceiving. He was breaking all the rules for her, while she was still, technically, bound by them. The sketchbook felt impossibly heavy in her hands, a symbol of both a future she desperately wanted and a lie she could no longer bear. The contract had unraveled, and she was terrified that when it finally tore completely, it would take her own heart with it. The idyllic rhythm of their secret life, a life measured in whispered confessions and stolen nights, had lulled them into a dangerous complacency. They had begun to believe in their own lie, to imagine that the bubble they had created within the ivy-covered walls of the estate was impermeable. But the real world, with its contracts, consequences, and cruel timelines, was patiently waiting to intrude. The first sign that their time was running out came not from a lawyer or a rival, but from the wise, knowing eyes of Walter Vance. It was a quiet, golden afternoon. Ethan had been called to the city for a series of urgent meetings he could no longer postpone, leaving Maya and Walter to their now familiar routine in the sunroom. She was reading an old volume of poetry to him, her voice a soft cadence in the warm, still air when he gently raised a frail hand. "That's enough for today, my dear," he said. His voice was weaker than usual, but his gaze was as sharp and clear as ever. "Come, sit closer, talk to me." "About." She moved her chair closer to his wheelchair, a sense of unease prickling at her. He was quiet for a long moment, watching a lone cardinal land on a bird feeder in the garden. "I watch him, you know," Walter began, his eyes still fixed on the bird. "My grandson. I've watched him his whole life. I watched him learn to walk, to ride a bicycle, to command a boardroom, but I haven't seen him truly happy in more than 20 years." He turned his gaze from the window to her, and its intensity was like a physical touch. "He's different with you. There's a light in his eyes when he looks at you, a light I thought had been extinguished long ago. It's like watching a man who has been living in a black and white film suddenly step into a world of vibrant color." Maya's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She felt the blood drain from her face. This was not the idle rambling of an old man. It was a gentle, deliberate dissection of her soul. She tried to formulate one of her practiced, charming responses, but he seemed to read her mind. "No, no, my dear. Don't trouble yourself with the proper answer," he said with a soft, knowing smile. "I'm too old to care about the proper answer. I only care about the true one." He let out a long, slow sigh. "In my life," he continued, his voice taking on a distant confessional tone, "I have built an empire on contracts, on strategic alliances, on sensible mergers. It's the world I was taught, the world I taught my son, and the world he, in turn, taught Ethan. It's a world that makes men powerful and rich, but it can leave their hearts utterly bankrupt." He paused, his gaze becoming piercing. "Victoria Ashton is a sensible merger, perhaps the most sensible one of all. You, my dear Maya, you make no sense at all. And that, I suspect, is why my grandson finally looks alive." The kindness was her undoing. It was 1,000 times more devastating than any accusation. If he had been angry, if he had called her a fraud, she could have defended herself. But this gentle, perceptive acceptance of her effect on Ethan, without questioning her origins, was an act of pure grace, and it made her lie feel like a sacrilege. He reached out and took her hand, his skin as thin and dry as old parchment. "I am a dying man, Maya. I have no more time for pretense. I only have time for the truth." His grip, though weak, was firm. He looked deep into her eyes, and he asked the question that shattered her completely. "I'm not asking you about contracts or last names. I'm asking you about my boy. Are you good for his soul?" A sob caught in her throat. She couldn't speak. The lie, the money, the entire charade. It all felt like a monstrous betrayal of this good, wise man. Tears welled and spilled down her cheeks. All she could manage was a choked, whispered sentence that was the truest thing she had ever said. I care for him. Very much." Walter held her hand for a moment longer, a look of profound, sad understanding on his face. He nodded slowly. "That is all an old man can hope to hear," he said, before a wave of exhaustion came over him, and his eyes drifted closed. The conversation left Maya hollowed out, her guilt a living, breathing thing inside her, but she had no time to process it. An hour later, the head nurse came to find her, her face grim. "Mr. Vance had taken a turn. His breathing was shallow, his pulse was weak. The doctor was on his way, but the prognosis was clear. The end was no longer a gentle decline, it was an imminent arrival. It was a matter of days, perhaps even hours. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She had to call Ethan. She rushed to the library to get his phone, which he'd forgotten in his haste that morning to find his number. As her fingers closed around the cool metal, the screen lit up. And in that moment, the entire fantasy of their isolated love affair was violently obliterated. It was a rapid-fire assault from the world they had forgotten. A preview of a text from his chief operating officer flashed across the top of the screen. "Board meeting has been moved up to tomorrow. The Ashton merger is on the agenda. Your absence is causing a significant problem. You need to be here." Before that banner could even fade, another appeared. It was from Victoria. And then another, and another, a rapid succession of blows. "I know you're ignoring me, Ethan. My father has been in contact with yours. This is getting out of hand. And then, the final, devastating message, the ultimatum that put a price on their love. You have 24 hours to end this ridiculous charade with your artist. If I don't hear from you, the merger is off, and I will make it my personal mission to ensure the entire world knows exactly why. Maya stared at the screen, the words blurring through her tears. The beautiful secret world they had built was a ridiculous charade. Their love, the only real thing in his life, was now the very thing that could cost him everything he was supposed to inherit, the legacy he was born to protect. Just then, she heard the front door open and Ethan's frantic footsteps in the hall. He rushed in, his face pale with worry. "I came as soon as I could. How is he?" he asked, his voice ragged. She could only shake her head, handing him the phone. He's fading, Ethan." And then, with a hand that trembled, she held out his phone. "And this." He took it from her, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked down, and she watched, as he read the messages. She watched the worry on his face morph into a stark, visceral shock. She watched the color drain from his cheeks, leaving him looking ashen, broken. The two great pillars of his existence, his grandfather's life and his family's empire, were crumbling in the very same hour. He looked up from the phone, his eyes finding hers across the room, and in his gaze, she saw the brutal, impossible truth. Their idyllic fantasy had just collided with reality, and the impact was about to destroy them all. The house had become a tomb, holding its breath. Walter Vance was dying in his room down the hall, and the quiet that settled over the grand estate was a heavy, suffocating shroud. Time had ceased to be a gentle flow, instead becoming a torturous, ticking countdown, measured by the hushed footsteps of the nurse and the somber chiming of the grandfather clock in the foyer. The glittering, sun-drenched bubble where Ethan and Maya had fallen in love had not just been popped, it had been atomized, leaving behind a cold, dark vacuum. Reality, in all its brutal, unforgiving forms, had laid siege to their fortress. The dying patriarch, the impending boardroom coup, the wrath of a woman scorned, it was an assault from all sides, and they were trapped in the epicenter. Ethan was a ghost of the man he had been. He moved through the halls with a hollowed-out look in his eyes, his body vibrating with a tension that never ceased. He was a son and grandson grieving, and a CEO watching his empire, his entire life's purpose, teeter on the brink of an abyss. He was trapped in a whirlwind of hushed, urgent phone calls with doctors, lawyers, and his increasingly frantic father. Maya watched him, her own heart, a leaden weight in her chest. Every ounce of her wanted to comfort him, to hold him, but the foundation of their relationship, the contract, the lie, had become a chasm between them. The guilt she felt over her deception of Walter was now magnified 1,000 times over. Her very presence, the love that had become her reason for breathing, was the catalyst for Ethan's ruin. They sat for hours on a bench in the dimly lit upstairs hallway, a silent, helpless vigil. Words were useless, inadequate. The magnitude of their impending losses was too vast to be contained in language. Late into the night, after the doctor had left with a final, grim shake of his head, the last vestiges of Ethan's formidable control finally crumbled. He sat staring at the polished floorboards, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. He slowly turned his head and looked at Maya, and in his eyes, she saw the terrified, lonely boy he must have been, a boy who was about to lose everything. He said nothing, but his gaze was a desperate, primal plea. He reached for her hand, and his grip wasn't that of a lover, but of a drowning man reaching for the last piece of driftwood in a raging sea. Wordlessly, he stood and led her away from his grandfather's door. He didn't take her to the library, the scene of their passionate surrenders, but to his bedroom, the sanctuary, where they had whispered their deepest secrets in the dark, the one place that had truly become theirs. Once the door was closed, sealing them off from the world of death and duty, the dam of his composure broke. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in the curve of her neck, and a single raw, ragged sob was torn from his chest. It was the sound of a lifetime of grief, of pressure, of loneliness, finally breaking free. He held on to her, shaking, and she held him back just as tightly, stroking his hair, whispering his name like a prayer, her own silent tears soaking the collar of his shirt. The shared grief was an unbearable intimacy. It was too pure, too painful. And in that crucible of despair, Their sorrow and fear began to transmute into something else, a frantic, desperate need that was as urgent as breathing. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, and his mouth found hers. The kiss was not soft or tender. It was a savage, searching thing. It was a kiss of utter desperation, as if he were trying to absorb her, to memorize the taste of her, to make her a permanent part of himself so that the world could not tear her away. There was no seduction, no gentle undressing. Their clothes were an intolerable barrier, obstacles to be shed with a clumsy, frantic urgency. Buttons were fumbled, zippers pulled, fabric cast aside until there was nothing left between them but skin and sorrow. He pushed her gently back onto the vast, cool sheets of the bed, his body covering hers, a shield against the horrors waiting outside the door. He looked down at her in the dim moonlight, his face a mask of such anguish that it stole her breath. "Don't leave me, Maya," he whispered, the words a raw, broken plea. It was a complete reversal of their beginning, of the powerful man who had hired her. He was utterly vulnerable, completely undone. "Please. Whatever happens with the company, with everything, don't you leave me." His words were a knife in her heart, twisting the guilt into an agony. The lie, the goddamned, unforgivable lie of their contract, rose in her throat like bile. She had to say it. She had to try and build a wall to protect her own heart from the shattering that was to come. "Ethan, we can't," she sobbed, even as her hands clutched at his back, pulling him closer. "This was never real. Don't you see? It was a contract. It was just a job." She said the words, the cruelest words she could think of, hoping to wound him enough that the final separation would hurt less. It was a desperate, foolish gambit. He silenced her with another kiss, a kiss that tasted of the salt of both their tears. He refused to accept her lie. "You," he said, his voice thick and absolute, his forehead pressed against hers. "You are the only thing in my entire life that has ever been real." And that was her final undoing. Her surrender was absolute. This, their final time together, was an act of pure desperation. It was a frantic, almost violent attempt to defy the inevitable, to merge their bodies so completely that they could forget, for a few precious moments, that their souls were about to be torn apart. His every touch was a frantic plea, his every kiss a sorrowful farewell. The pleasure that rose between them was not a soft, joyful thing. It was a sharp, piercing, almost painful ecstasy, a knife's edge of feeling that was inextricably linked to their despair. It was the beautiful, agonizing pinnacle of their love and their loss, a shared climax that was not a release into bliss, but a shattering into a million pieces. It was a brief, mutual oblivion in the face of the end. Afterwards, they lay tangled in the sheets, their bodies slick with sweat and tears, their ragged breaths the only sound in the room. But there was no peace, no gentle afterglow. The silence that descended was the hollow, echoing silence of the abyss that had finally opened up beneath them. They both knew, without having to say it, that this was the end. This was the final, desperate, beautiful, and heartbreaking consummation of their impossible love. The dream was over, and outside the bedroom door, the real world, in all its cruelty, was waiting to claim its due. The end arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, final exhalation in the pre-dawn stillness. Walter Vance passed away peacefully in his sleep, and with him, the entire reason for the elaborate fiction of Maya and Ethan's life together ceased to exist. The house, which had been holding its breath, transitioned into a place of hushed, organized grief. Distant relatives arrived, their faces composed in masks of formal sorrow, and the world moved on with the grim logistics of a funeral for a great man. In the midst of this somber, quiet chaos, Maya packed her single suitcase. There were no dramatic farewells, no tearful confrontations. Their true goodbye had already happened, a raw and desperate sacrament in the tangled sheets of his bed. The contract had been fulfilled, the final payment transferred to her account with the silent, impersonal efficiency of a bank wire. She saw him one last time across the crowded foyer as he stood receiving condolences, his face a pale, stoic mask. Their eyes met for a fleeting, eternal second, a silent exchange that spoke of love, of loss, and of a shared, unbearable sorrow. Then she turned, walked out the heavy oak door, and disappeared from his life as quietly as she had entered it. The actress had played her part, and it was time for the curtain to fall. A week later, after the eulogies had been spoken and the last of the mourners had departed, the family lawyers convened in the library. As expected, Ethan inherited control of the Vance empire. But tucked within the legal documents was a sealed, personal letter from his grandfather. Ethan opened it with trembling hands. The letter didn't speak of stock prices or board members. It spoke of a life's worth of regrets. Walter wrote of building a dynasty but neglecting the small joys of confusing the value of a company with the worth of a life. "I spent a lifetime acquiring things, my boy," the letter concluded, only to realize at the very end that the only thing that truly matters is the light in a person's eyes when they look at you. "The world will tell you to be powerful. I am telling you to be happy. Do not make the same mistakes I did." It was Walter's final, and perhaps greatest, act of love. The next day, Ethan placed 2 calls. The first was to Victoria's father, formally dissolving their family's long-standing business alliance. The second was to Victoria, a brief, quiet, and final conversation that ended their cold, transactional relationship for good. He was a changed man, and his old life no longer fit. He had everything he had been fighting for: the company, the power, the legacy, but the victory was a hollow, echoing thing. The vast, silent mansion had never felt so empty. 6 months passed, the seasons turned, and the raw edges of grief began to soften into a dull, permanent ache. In a bright, sun-drenched studio in a quiet corner of the city, Maya Reed was finally living her dream. The money had bought her freedom, time, and the finest materials. Her career was taking off. A prestigious gallery had taken notice of her work. She was independent, successful, and completely, utterly haunted. On the central easel in her studio was her latest work, a large, abstract canvas. It was a chaotic swirl of dark, stormy blues and grays, but in the very center was a small, fiercely protected space of warm, golden light. And within that light, barely visible, was the ghost of a man's face, his eyes full of a beautiful, tragic longing. Her art, which had once been vibrant and hopeful, was now infused with a profound, melancholic depth. She was painting her memories, trying to make sense of a love that had felt more real than life itself. Miles away, in a glass tower overlooking the city, Ethan Vance commanded his empire with a new, quiet authority. He was more successful than ever, his business acumen sharper, his decisions more decisive. But those who knew him well saw a change. The cold arrogance was gone, replaced by a remote, contemplative sadness. He was a king ruling over a vast, empty kingdom. One afternoon, as the city lights began to sparkle below, he unlocked a drawer in his massive, minimalist desk. He pushed aside billion-dollar contracts and merger agreements. Inside, carefully preserved, was a small piece of charcoal-smudged paper. It was a quick sketch she had made one night, a drawing of his face in sleep, left behind in her haste to disappear. He picked it up, his thumb gently tracing the lines of the portrait, the only tangible piece of her he had left. They existed in their separate worlds, bound by an invisible thread of memory, an artist whose hands were now guided by loss, and a CEO who had gained the world only to understand what he had been forced to sacrifice. There was no neat ending to their story, no final chapter. Their love affair had been a brilliant, impossible supernova, a celestial event that had burned too brightly and had collapsed in on itself, leaving behind only the echo of its light. Perhaps, one day, he would use his immense resources to go looking for the artist whose phantom touch still woke him in the dead of night. Or perhaps, the memory of their real nights was a masterpiece too perfect and too painful to ever risk touching again.